Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're heading to 19th century New Orleans.
Ooh, New Orleans.
Yeah, city known for its secrets and shadows even today, right?
Yeah, it's right.
But, within those shadows, there lived this woman named Mary Jane Jackson,
Okay.
or Bricktop, as she was called. And her story is more captivating and more brutal than any fiction I've ever read.
Uh-huh.
I've got a stack of sources here about her life, and let me tell you, it's one you won't forget.
I am intrigued. What is it about Bricktop's life that is so intriguing?
Well, for me, it's how her life is almost a mirror, to the turbulent times she lived in. We're talking about New Orleans in the mid-1800s.
Right.
It's a far cry from, the romanticized Old South that we often
It's
imagine.
worse, yeah. It was a very different time.
Exactly. So thinking about that, her story begins in 1836. She's born into poverty, and as a woman, the options available to her were, well, incredibly limited.
I can imagine.
And in fact, by the age of 13, she had already entered prostitution. That alone really speaks volumes, about the realities for women in her position back then.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes you think about how much of her trajectory was truly a choice,
Yeah.
How much was just dictated by the circumstances she was born into. That's a pretty harsh truth that for many women in poverty, this was one of the only ways to survive.
Yeah. And it's very clear that Bricktop had this fiery spirit, even from a young age.
Really?
At just 14, she becomes involved with this saloon owner.
Yeah.
But it's not the kind of, like romanticized relationship you might see in a movie.
Okay.
3 years later, she ends up assaulting him
Oh, wow.
so severely that he was hospitalized and even lost an ear.
Oh my goodness.
It's a really shocking early glimpse,
Yeah.
into the violence that will become a defining part of her story.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes you wonder, this event, was it like a turning point for her? It's hard not to see it as foreshadowing of what's to come. Maybe a sign of, simmering rage against the constraints that she faced.
Yeah, I think you're right. And in 1856, at just 20 years old, she commits her first murder.
Wow. Okay.
A man insults her, and she beats him to death. The following year, another victim, this guy Long Charlie,
Mm.
is killed by her blade. These are brutal acts, no question. But is it too simplistic to just say, oh, this was just like blind rage?
It's never that straightforward, is it?
Mm.
I think while her actions were undoubtedly impulsive and driven by anger, it's crucial to consider how her early life experiences, that constant struggle, the lack of options, may have, all contributed to this, like almost instinctive reaction to any perceived threat.
That's a really good point. You bring up a really interesting point there.
Mm.
Then in 1859, there's this infamous saloon brawl. Bricktop, along with two other women, Ellen Collins and America Williams, end up in this confrontation with a blacksmith named Laurent Fleury. And get this, it all starts because Fleury simply asks Bricktop to stop cursing.
Oh, wow. What happened?
But her response is pure defiance.
Oh.
She just, escalates the situation, and it descends into this chaos. What's so fascinating about this to me is the audacity, right? Not only does she attack Fleury, but she also ends up getting away with his stolen money.
She robbed him too.
Yeah, the sources depict this scene, and it's just wild. It's like a whirlwind of violence.
Oh, my goodness.
But what's even more shocking is that despite being apprehended, Bricktop walks free because of a botched autopsy.
Really? So they just let her go? That's crazy. I mean, that must have been a relatively common occurrence back then.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. It really makes you wonder about the effectiveness, or maybe even the biases within the legal system of that era.
For sure.
Imagine a woman essentially getting away with assault and robbery because of a procedural error. It's unbelievable. Could this have emboldened her, maybe reinforce this idea that she could act with impunity?
It's definitely a question worth considering. And yet, despite this life that is, just filled with violence, there's another side to Bricktop. While in prison, she forms a connection with another criminal, John Miller. It's hard to imagine, finding love in such a dark setting. But their story is a testament to the complexities of human nature.
Okay, so tell me about John Miller.
Well, he was a character. I mean, he was a jailer who was also a criminal,
Right.
and even a fight manager.
Wow.
And he was even implicated in several murders himself.
Oh, my goodness.
So their connection really adds this whole new layer to Bricktop's story.
Yeah.
It begs the question, did they find solace in each other's darkness? Like a shared understanding in a world that just seemed to reject them.
Right. It's almost like a twisted Bonnie and Clyde tale,
Yeah.
set against the backdrop of 19th century New Orleans. And they embark on this crime spree, robbing their way through the French Quarter. I mean, there's a certain allure to that kind of rebellious spirit, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, for sure. But we can't forget the real consequences of their actions.
Right.
These weren't victimless crimes. Their choices had a ripple effect, causing harm and suffering to innocent people.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened to them?
Well, their story takes a dark turn on December 5th, 1861.
Mhm.
Miller tells neighbors that Bricktop needed a thrashing before entering their Gretna home.
Oh, no.
It's like a chilling foreshadowing of what's to come. What happened behind closed doors is left to our imaginations, but the outcome is undeniable.
Yeah, what happened?
Miller's found dead, stabbed fatally. Bricktop is charged with manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years, but she's released early during all the chaos of the Civil War. And then she vanishes. Poof, gone.
She just disappeared.
Yeah. It's as if she stepped into the fog and was never seen again. This sudden disappearance is almost as captivating as the rest of her story, right?
Right.
It raises so many questions. Was this like a calculated escape or another impulsive act driven by circumstance? Did she seek to reinvent herself, or was she destined to just be consumed by, the shadows that had always surrounded her?
It's crazy. It's one of the most intriguing parts of her story.
Yeah,
We're left to speculate, to piece together these fragments of information that we have and just try to understand what might have driven her to vanish so completely.
I know. It really makes you wonder, did she ever find peace? Or was she just forever haunted by, the life she had led? It's like a ghost story almost, isn't it? This woman who lives so intensely and then just vanishes, poof, into thin air.
Yeah. There's a certain poetry to it, wouldn't you say? But even without knowing her ultimate fate, I think there's so much that we can glean from Bricktop's story.
Absolutely. It's like she's this, cracked mirror
Yeah.
held up to 19th century New Orleans.
That's good. I like that. Yeah. And we see the poverty, the lawlessness, the, very limited options for women, especially back then. All these elements that really shaped her life.
Yeah.
And you know what? She really challenges our preconceived notions about women in history.
Right.
Bricktop was certainly not a passive figure.
Yeah.
She was bold, she was defiant, and she absolutely refused to be a victim, even if her methods were often brutal.
Totally. And thinking about that time period, again, leading up to the Civil War, it's important to remember the immense social upheaval that was happening. Do you think that, contributed to a sense of lawlessness? Or even just leniency in the legal system?
That's a fascinating question. We know that Bricktop got away with assault and robbery because of a technicality.
Right.
And then the manslaughter charge for Miller's death. Was that a sign of the times, or was it just a series of, fortunate events for her?
Yeah. It makes you wonder if her story would have played out differently in a more stable, less tumultuous era. Maybe, just maybe, she could have found a different path. But then again, her fiery temperament seems to have been such a core part of who she was, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the, crux of it, isn't it? How much of our path is determined by circumstance and how much is driven by our own, innate nature?
Right, exactly. It's that age-old question. Are we products of our environment? Or are we destined to become who we are, regardless of, those external forces?
Exactly. I mean, we can speculate all we want, but ultimately we're left with this puzzle of Mary Jane Jackson.
Yeah.
A woman capable of both immense violence and, surprising connection. Someone who lived life on her own terms, even if those terms were often brutal.
Right. And we can't forget the victims in all of this.
That's right.
Their stories are so interwoven with hers. And their losses are such a stark reminder that Bricktop's actions had real and tragic consequences.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the drama, the intrigue of her story, but it's essential to acknowledge the pain that was inflicted, the lives that were, irrevocably changed because of her choices.
Yeah. Speaking of choices, there's another aspect of her story that I find particularly interesting, and that's how she navigated the legal system.
Yeah, okay.
It seems like she was constantly pushing boundaries, testing the limits of what she could get away with.
Yeah, and she did get away with quite a lot. It makes you wonder about the effectiveness of law enforcement back then, especially when it came to crimes involving women.
Right.
Was there a level of dismissal, perhaps even a belief that women were incapable of such brutality, or was it simply a matter of corruption and incompetence?
Well, that's where the historical context comes in. Knowing what you already do about New Orleans in this era, does Bricktop's story fit, the narrative you have in mind? Or does it challenge your assumptions about the legal system and societal norms at the time?
It's definitely a case that makes you re-examine any preconceived notions you might have had.
Right.
Here's a woman who committed multiple murders, robberies, assaults, and yet she managed to evade true justice for, you know, a significant portion of her life.
It really raises so many questions about power dynamics, gender roles, and the very definition of justice in a society, on the brink of a civil war.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, did that looming conflict, that sense of impending chaos, contribute to a, breakdown in law and order?
It's a plausible theory. When societal structures start to crumble, it's often the most marginalized, those already living on the fringes, who are impacted the most.
Right.
Did Bricktop exploit this instability? Did she see it as an opportunity to, operate with even greater impunity?
It's fascinating to speculate, isn't it? And it highlights how individual stories, like Bricktop's, can offer valuable insights into larger historical trends.
Mm.
We often focus on the major players, the politicians and generals, but it's the lives of ordinary people that truly illuminate the complexities of a given era.
It reminds us that history isn't just a, collection of dates and battles. It's a tapestry woven from countless individual experiences, each one contributing to the richness and texture of the overall narrative.
And in Bricktop's case, that narrative is one of defiance, violence, and ultimately mystery.
Right.
Her disappearance is like a final act of rebellion, a
Mm.
refusal to be confined by, the expectations of her time. It's a fitting end to a life lived on the edge, a life that continues to fascinate and challenge us long after she vanished from the historical record.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming circumstances, individuals have the capacity to shape their own destinies, even if those destinies are often messy, unpredictable, and ultimately unknowable.
Yeah, it's true. And while we, may never know exactly what became of Bricktop, I think her story serves as a powerful reminder that history is, rarely neat and tidy.
It's not just about the grand narratives, like the wars and the revolutions. It's also about those individual lives, right? Lived
Yeah.
within those tumultuous times, the choices made, the consequences faced, and, those mysteries that linger long after the events themselves have faded from memory.
Totally. And Bricktop's story is a perfect example of that, right?
Yeah.
She was both a product of her environment and an agent of chaos within it.
Yeah.
She challenged societal norms, defied expectations, and ultimately, left us with more questions than answers.
That brings up a really crucial point though, right? By diving into these individual stories, I think we gain a much, much deeper understanding of the nuances of the past. It allows us to see beyond the surface, to grapple with the complexities of human nature and, the often blurred lines between victim and perpetrator.
Right. It's so easy to just fall into that trap of, labeling people as simply good or bad, hero or villain.
Right.
But Bricktop's story reminds us that life is rarely, that black and white.
Right. She was capable of, great violence, but also of forming genuine connections. She was a victim of circumstance, but also someone who made deliberate choices that had a, profound impact on others.
I think that's what makes her story so compelling. It forces us to confront our own assumptions about morality and justice and those forces that shape individual destinies.
I agree. So thinking back on all the sources that we've examined, was there anything that particularly struck you about Bricktop's story? What resonated most with you?
Hmm. For me, it was the way that she navigated a world that just seemed determined to keep her down. She refused to be defined by her circumstances, even if her methods were often destructive. There's this certain rebellious spirit there that I find both fascinating and unsettling.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, it's that tension, right, between admiration for her resilience and the stark reality of her actions that makes her story so thought-provoking. It's not about, condoning her violence, but rather attempting to understand that complex web of factors that, contributed to it.
Right. And perhaps, that's the most valuable lesson that we can take away from this whole deep dive. It's a reminder to approach history and, indeed life itself with a sense of curiosity and empathy and a willingness to, embrace the gray areas.
I like that. Well said. Because, it's in those gray areas, in the spaces between the lines, where those most profound truths often reside. And, it's by exploring those spaces, by asking the difficult questions and challenging our own preconceptions that we can truly, begin to make sense of the world around us.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our exploration of Bricktop, I would encourage you, the listener, to consider this. How does her story challenge your own understanding of women in history? of the interplay between circumstance and choice, and of that enduring power of mystery to, captivate and intrigue us. It's a story that will stay with me, I'm sure of it, and I hope it does the same for you.